My guide kind of led me through. We were walking through rubble, essentially, and you could see bits and pieces of pottery and even some coins and, stuff that's just been laying there completely out in the open for centuries.
Well, how did it feel walking through all that history?
It was surreal. I kind of kept looking at my guide like, really? It's so good. Like, I was waiting for somebody to sort of come and, arrest us or something. Say like, wait, what are you doing there? You're not supposed to be there. And they didn't. And we set up camp right outside the walls of the city. Yeah, it's just absolutely surreal. I mean, you look at it and you think of how few people get into Turkmenistan and how few people had been in that place before me.
Welcome to Whiskey and a Map. Stories of adventure and exploration as told by those who live them. Katie Aune, in addition to her professional life, is a travel blogger and writer. She has traveled to nearly 70 countries in all 7 continents. In August 2011, Katie set off to explore all 15 states of the former Soviet Union, an adventure far off the typical tourist track. From riding the Trans-Siberian Railway across Russia and taking a cargo ferry from Ukraine to Georgia, to the Silk Road in Tajikistan, and camping in the deserts of Turkmenistan. This adventure became her book, Finding Katya. Katie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a nice day outside, so it's going good. Now, here at Whiskey and a Map, we always start off with a tradition of having our guests tell us a good drinking story. Do you have one for us?
I do. I'll give you a little background here. So this took place while I was traveling through the former Soviet Union. I had taken the ferry across the Black Sea from Ukraine to Georgia, arrived in Batumi, Georgia, and I was getting ready to take a night train from Batumi to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. I was exhausted from the ferry. I just wanted nothing more to get on this train and go to sleep. And the ticket I had was a 4-person compartment. I was the first one in and was just really hoping that I would have the whole thing to myself and nobody else would join me. Much to my chagrin, that was not the case initially. I was soon joined by 3 different Georgian men, one older gentleman and then 2 younger guys, probably in their 20s. And the 2 younger guys came in and they had a bottle of cognac and a bag of chips and a chocolate bar, and they set it down on the table in between us. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. And as soon as the train departed the station, it was probably about 10:30 p.m. It was an overnight train. They opened up the bottle, they took some plastic cups out and started pouring shots. And it was March 8th, which is International Women's Day, which is a really big deal in Russia and a lot of the former Soviet countries. And I should add, none of the 3 of them spoke English. So I spoke Russian. The older gentleman spoke Georgian, Russian, and Spanish, and I speak a little bit of Spanish. But the 2 younger guys only spoke Georgian. They didn't even speak Russian or English. So we had a bit of a language barrier, but we went through, and the older gentleman translated as the younger guys started doing toasts. And it was, these toasts to my mother and my sisters and all the women in the world. And everybody kept taking turns doing shots of cognac and then chasing it with these potato chips and the chocolate bar. And when we got to the first stop, probably 45 minutes later, one of them gets off the train and comes back with a second bottle. And so it just kept going for a while. Before I knew it, they had a radio with them. They had turned on some traditional Georgian music. Guys get up and start taking turns dancing. In our tiny little compartment, they're dancing between the bunk beds, and they pull me up and get me up dancing as well. And that went on till about, I don't know, probably 1 or 2 in the morning. And finally, at some point I was sort of like, okay, yeah, I've had enough. And every time they went to refill my glass, I was just like, choot choot, like, which is Russian for like just a little bit. And they respected that. But yeah, it went from, me thinking and hoping I was going to have a very relaxed train ride into Tbilisi to a very, very crazy night drinking with strangers on a train.
What an experience. And trying to dance in those small little cubicles.
Yes. I wish back then, this was in 2012, so I didn't have, we didn't have smartphones then, so I didn't have any video of it. I wish now, in retrospect, that I had some video of it.
Well, I want to ask you a lot of questions about your travels through the Soviet Union, because that is the subject of your book, with lots of good descriptions of those travels. But before we go there, you also, at least up until most recently, were a marathoner. In fact, just not a marathoner, an international marathoner. And your goal, at least at one time, was to run a marathon on all 7 continents. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I ran my first marathon back in 2008. Didn't start running until I was in my 30s. And at some point, just decided to combine my love of travel with my love of running. Actually did my first international marathon, was actually at the start of my trip around the former Soviet Union. I did the Tallinn Marathon in Estonia, and that was my European marathon. But then I went on to do marathons. I did the Great Wall of China Marathon. I did the Big Five Marathon in South Africa. And so, yeah, my goal, and I would say it still is a goal to hit 7 marathons on 7 continents.
The former Soviet Union, what inspired you to leave your career and spend 13 months traveling those former states?
Excellent question. It's the question I get all the time. So I was a Russian and East European Studies major in college. I started college in the mid-90s, right after the Soviet Union sort of broke apart, after the Berlin Wall came down. And so at that time, it seemed to me like, this could be like the next big area for business and that I would be sort of ahead of the curve by majoring in Russian and East European Studies. I had been fascinated with Russia since I was in kind of elementary school, junior high. I had read a biography of Catherine the Great for a book report, and just absolutely was just absolutely fascinated with her. And so even into high school, I was doing, I remember I did like a research project about the Warsaw Pact, just was kind of eating up everything I could about that area of the world. And so I was living in Chicago. And I started dreaming up this idea around 2009, I think, and started thinking about, I had been in Chicago for quite a while. I was kind of thinking about making a change in my job and just, leaving Chicago, and came up with this idea that I would leave my job in the spring and take the summer off and travel, and then find a job back in my home state of Minnesota in the fall. And so I had sort of targeted Russia for that 3 months of the summer of where I thought I would go. I ended up getting offered a promotion at work. It ended up making sense for me to stay on the job for an extra year. And in that extra year that I had, I saved up more money. I started taking Russian lessons again. I had studied Russian language in college, but needed a refresher. And then I started meeting people online through very early days of travel blogging, other people who had quit their jobs to travel long term. And that was something that back then, it just wasn't really a thing that Americans did in particular. I think it was much, somewhat common in the UK and Australia, but for Americans, not normal. And so the more that I talked to other people who had done it, it started feeling like something real. And I started thinking about doing a much longer trip. And I had read a lot about the Silk Road. I was really interested in Central Asia. And at one point, so I kind of kept adding countries to the list. And at one point, I just pulled up a list of all of the former Soviet states, and there were 15. And so I like having goals. And so I thought, okay, let's just make it a goal. I'm going to visit all 15 of them. And that's what I did. Over 13 months, I threw in a few other countries along the way and took a few detours, but hit all 15 in 13 months.
One of the things that struck me in your book was some of the places that you saw in the history, the monasteries and cave paintings and so forth. Tell us about those.
Yeah, really, Armenia and Georgia, I think both were incredible in that way. Those are a couple of the first Christian nations. There's monasteries and churches that, go back to like the 4th century, which especially coming from the United States, where we're so incredibly young compared to, anything over in, Europe and Africa and Asia. But so to be in these places and walking in these buildings that have been preserved for all these centuries, it just gives you such a different perspective on things and this appreciation. I had the chance, the ancient capital of Armenia is actually now today in eastern Turkey called Aune. And I had a chance to visit there while I was in Turkey. And I was the only visitor there. I had the entire place to myself. And it basically was like walking through this open air museum, but nothing had been preserved. I mean, everything was just sort of left as it was because it was a city that was just completely abandoned in the early 20th century. And so you have these, churches with these amazing frescoes and brightly colored paintings that are just there. And nobody is really, nobody's seeing them. There's not a lot of visitors there. It was just, I felt so incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to see so much of that, because I think it's something, and I think you're gonna bring this up later, but I write about in the book just how much, even as someone who majored in Russian and East European studies and took classes in history and whatnot, how much of this I never really learned about. And I think especially in the U.S. in general, for anyone, unless you're a history major and you're really, really studying these things, for the classes that we get in high school and college, they barely scratch the surface on world history. And I think that was something that, throughout my trip and so many of the places I visited, but especially Georgia and Armenia, really that just stood out, the history there that I was not aware of at all before I got to those countries.
Besides liking cognac and dancing on trains, what were the people there like?
Oh my gosh, so incredibly friendly. It is, I think that's something, and we'll get into talking about Central Asia too, but just the most welcoming, friendly people. One of the things I left out of the train story, the older gentleman who was on the train in Georgia with me, at some point in the evening, he was asking me, where else in Georgia I was planning to go. And I mentioned the city of Tel Aviv. And he tells me his mother-in-law lives in Tel Aviv. It's probably, 11 p.m. And he picks up his cell phone and he calls his mother-in-law and he tells her, I'm on a train with this American woman. She's going to come visit you in Tel Aviv, which, it blew my mind because that kind of thing just does not happen, here in the U.S. And so people everywhere I went, it was the same thing when I took the boat over across the Black Sea. Most of the other people on the boat were Georgian. And so at the very end, I started talking to some other Georgians on the boat as we were getting ready to depart. And several of them gave me their phone numbers, told me if I came there through their town to let them know I would have a place to stay. Just such incredibly welcoming, friendly people. And the other thing that really struck me was how aware they were of what was happening in the U.S.
Really?
I had a conversation with a taxi driver in Georgia, and we were speaking Russian, and this was the spring of 2012. So the presidential primaries were going on in the U.S., and he asked me who I thought was going to win the Republican presidential nomination. And he was very much in favor of Mitt Romney. And his reasoning was that if Mitt Romney became president, Georgia would have a better chance of getting into NATO.
Wow.
And I was just blown away.
So you make it into the stands, and as a history buff that you are, this is where the Silk Road was. Folks who don't know what the Silk Road was and why it was so important, and what sparked your interest in retracing those steps?
I think some of my interest really sparked by reading an author, Colin, I'm going to butcher his last name, Colin Thubron, Thubron. Don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he wrote a lot about his travels in Central Asia and the Silk Road. And I had read those books and just really sparked my interest. Silk Road is basically an old trade route. It's actually a couple different routes that kind of comprise the Silk Road. but that basically goes across Central Asia into China. So connecting the Middle East with China and India and, trading back and forth silks, but also spices and other things. And yeah, so I think that the bulk of what I saw of the Silk Road is in what today is Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan is ever so slightly more accessible than Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is often referred to as the North Korea of Central Asia. It is an extremely closed off country. It is very difficult to get a visa there. There's a lot of restrictions on traveling around. And the difference between how well the Silk Road sites in Uzbekistan have been maintained and how the ones in Turkmenistan have been maintained is extremely different. If you go to Uzbekistan and you go to Samarkand or Bukhara, which are kind of two of the main cities, also Khiva, which is further west, you go to Samarkand and there are, you have to buy a ticket to go into the, the mosque or the madrasa and, and not everything, but a lot of things have been restored and, are in fairly good, good condition given, that they're thousands of years old. You go to Turkmenistan and I mean, one of the things I write about in the book is this experience of just camping in the middle of the desert next to one of these Silk Road sites. And there's no fencing, there's no guards, there's no ticket booth. And it's literally just crumbles all around us of a city that once had been, I don't want to mess this up, but I think it once had been a city of like 100,000 people. So not an inconsequential city. And it previously had been on the banks of a river that ended up during a spout of, the climate changing, the river changed course or dried up or something. And so with the river not there anymore, the value of the city kind of went away and it became abandoned. And now it's just sitting there. And my guide kind of led me through, we were walking through rubble essentially, and you could see bits and pieces of pottery and even some coins and, stuff that's just been laying there completely out in the open for centuries.
Well, how did it feel walking through all that history?
It was surreal. I kind of kept looking at my guide like, really? It's okay. Like I was waiting for somebody to sort of come and, arrest us or something, say like, wait, what are you doing there? You're not supposed to be there. And they didn't. And we set up camp right outside the walls of the city. At sunset, we actually climbed up a minaret that I think had been built back in like the 9th century. It was a little scary. There were times it didn't feel completely secure, but yeah, it just absolutely surreal. I mean, you look at it and you think of how few people get into Turkmenistan and how few people had been in that place before me. And it's almost hard to put into words because it was such an incredibly unique experience that, it's one of the few times I did the whole trip solo. And I do a lot of my travel solo. I generally like traveling solo a lot. Turkmenistan was really the one place where I had a number of moments where I was like, I really wish there was somebody here with me, like that I was with a friend or a travel buddy or something so that, years from now, I could be like, gosh, you remember that time we were in Turkmenistan? Because it's just one of those places that, and this place in particular. So the thing with Turkmenistan, and it may have changed since COVID, but at the time I went, the common thing was to get a transit visa, which allowed you to be in the country for 5 days. And if you got a transit visa, you didn't have to be accompanied by a guide. You could travel independently if you only had a transit visa. The thing with the transit visa was you truly had to be in transit. So I was going to be coming from Uzbekistan into Turkmenistan and then going back into Uzbekistan. So that's not considered in transit. In transit is if you're going from like Iran up to Uzbekistan or something like that. And so I went through a travel company to get a tourist visa. And so the people that do the transit visa basically just do the capital of Ashgabat, and then they do the Darvasa gas crater, which is this crater in the middle of the desert that has been on fire since like the 1950s or 60s. And that's a whole other incredible thing.
Well, actually, as you mentioned it, George Coronis, I don't know if you know who that is. He's the host of Angry Planet.
Okay.
He's going to be on the podcast. In fact, I did his interview last week, and one of the stories it tells us about is about that crater and exploring it. So yeah, our podcast listeners are going to know it well. But yeah, it's an incredible gates of hell. I
won't steal his thunder then.
Well, did you go visit it?
Oh, yes. No, I went to visit it. I think that the point I was making, I ended up getting a tourist visa. So I was able to stay in the country for 11 days. I had a guide with me at all times, except for when I was in Ashgabat. But because I got a tourist visa, I was able to go to places like Mizraim, which was the city in the desert, and some other places that most people who just do the transit visa don't get to. But I did do the gas crater. That was absolutely incredible. Yeah, it's just a huge pit on fire, like nonstop for decades. And the fascinating thing is, I've heard they have since put a fence up around it, but at the time I visited, you could walk right up to the edge and there was no fence around it at all.
Yeah, I suppose there's some Darwinian selection going on right there if you get too close.
There were actually, well, you can't, most people who stay there, and I guess there's like a yurt camp near there now or something, but there was not when I was there. Most people just go and they camp overnight in the desert, but you can't camp too close to the fire because it's emitting gas. And so if you sleep too close to it, you're going to be, have not healthy gases, breathing that all night. But there were a couple tourists who came along, and when I was there, and they were going to set up their tent right next to the pit. And my guide had to go over and tell them, like, wait a second, you don't want to do that. You may not wake up in the morning.
Yeah, the guide interfered with natural selection.
Right.
Well, you mentioned about going into the deserts and the villages there. Tell us about that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it was, the desert, gosh, when I entered from the border in Uzbekistan and we drove down to the capital of Ashgabat, I don't know that I've ever seen so much desert in my life. It was just miles and miles. I mean, Turkmenistan is also one of, sort of the least populated countries in terms of people per mile or per kilometer. So you're just driving for miles and miles and miles, and there's just absolutely nothing but desert. And then the couple villages that we went into, I actually stayed the night in a village called Nokur up in the mountains near the southern border of the country, and stayed with a family there. And the thing that I remember so well from that, it was summertime when I was there. I mean, it was probably late July, early August. And so it was hot. It was, like daytime temperatures were getting up to 100 degrees. And so I was wearing sandals and no socks because it was very, very hot. And my host mother, the woman of the house where I was staying, really concerned about my feet and gave me a pair of socks. And I don't know if she was concerned that my feet were going to get cold, or just it was more cultural for them not to go in bare feet as much, but she gave me a pair of socks. And I kept those socks for several years. They were a good pair of socks. Yeah, it was the other thing that stood out to me from that was that I was there during Ramadan, and all of the countries in Central Asia technically are predominantly Muslim countries. But because they were part of the former Soviet Union, religion was really, during Stalin's times and during Soviet times, religion was really frowned upon. And so what I found was, a lot of the people I encountered were not strictly adhering to Ramadan as you would encounter if you were in, like Turkey or, other predominantly Muslim countries. And so we were at dinner and the sun had not gone down. And my guide and the host father poured shots of vodka. And I was like, I was just like, wait a second.
You look at the watch going,
like,
wait a minute.
I'm like, wait a second, this is not supposed to be happening. So it was interesting to see the, sort of the differences and, kind of those remnants of, clearly they've maintained their original culture in a lot of ways, but, some of those Soviet influences, from being part of that as well.
What did you notice about the culture of those folks out in the desert that struck you?
I think just one, their generosity, they're compared to, what you and I are used to, living in the U.S. with, electricity and internet and running water and, all of these different things and all of the comforts of home. And you go to, Turkmenistan, but also like the families. I lived with two different families in the mountains in Tajikistan, and they were, they had running water, but it wasn't like in the house. You had to go to a separate, a separate room, and it was kind of set up separately. Like they're just so generous, to what you and I would look at, we would look at them and like, oh my gosh, they're living in poverty. They're, very poor. They don't have all of these modern conveniences that we have, but they're so welcoming and so generous, with their food, with their hospitality, inviting you in, and where I think one of the really fortunate things that I did speak pretty decent Russian was that I was able to have not, super deep conversations with people, but at least, kind of enough conversation that, for them to know, where I was from and what I was doing there. And, I think one of the things that struck me is, as an American, you hear a lot that, people dislike American travelers and then, like, oh, you hear people say like, well, I'm not going to tell anyone I'm American when I'm traveling. They say they're Canadian instead or something. Everywhere I went in Central Asia, especially, and in Georgia and Armenia, as soon as I said I was American, oh my gosh, they were ecstatic. I mean, it was just, they were so proud to be able to welcome a visitor into their home. But then it was like, oh my gosh, you're American. Like, thank you so much for visiting our country. Welcome. And again, they were so up to speed. And I had a conversation in Tajikistan with a man there who, he was very familiar with, what the U.S. was doing in Afghanistan at the time. And, just their awareness of foreign affairs and the role that the U.S. was playing in different places was really fascinating to me because unfortunately us as Americans, we don't pay that much attention to what else is going on in the world. And so it really struck me how much, everywhere I went that people, were really up to speed on things and just so incredibly welcoming.
I'm going to switch gears on you because there's a couple other places I want to hear about. And one of them is you went to visit the Chernobyl site. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So it had actually, at the time I went in either late January, early February of 2012, it was in the middle of the winter. It had just reopened for visitors. It had been closed for a while, but you can do a day trip and visit Chernobyl. I think they actually offer overnight trips that people can do and spend a couple nights there. But I went with a group of, I don't know, there were probably 8 or 10 of us, and we met in the center of Kyiv and hopped into a van. And on the drive out there, they played a video for us that kind of went through the history of the explosion. I was probably 9 or 10 years old when it happened. And so, I had vague recollections of, hearing about, some, big explosion that happened, over in Europe. But, I wasn't old enough at the time to really know much. But so they played this video, and I was actually struck by how forthright the video was about the mistakes that were made in the wake of the explosion. That really stood out to me because you hear so much about, Soviet authorities covering things up and, and they waited several days before, they sort of told anybody what had happened. But they were pretty, like, the video was actually, pretty honest, I think, about, some of those mistakes. But we drove out there. There had just been a big snowfall. And so it was fascinating as we got into some of the abandoned towns, like, nobody had been there since this huge snowfall. And so at one point, our driver had to get out and, like, pull branches out of the way and kind of, move snow out of the way. But you get to visit, they take you first to, like, the only hotel that's kind of just inside the exclusion zone. They go and they give you radiation detectors and have you kind of go through that, which I don't know if that's really necessary or just sort of more of a, make it feel like you're actually exposing yourself to radiation. But then they show you, like, you see one of the vehicles that was used to clear the site, and your guide goes and takes the radiation detector up to the wheel, and it, kind of starts going off like there's still radiation there, however many years later. And then we visited the town of Pripyat, which is nearby. And what was interesting to me is we visited, like, a school and a kindergarten, and, everything. You go in thinking, like, oh, everything is just left exactly as it was when they evacuated, and there's, papers all over the place and stuff. But as I started looking around, there was actually a newspaper from, like, 1988, which was, like, 2 years later. And so it was sort of like, wait a second, what is this? But then you view the reactors from afar. I mean, they don't let you get, close to what's left of the reactors at all. But it was very eerie. I think listening to everything and actually seeing it, the thing that stuck with me, and I think I wrote about this a little bit in my book, is, and I'm careful about how I word this because, like, I don't want to, say anything. Like, obviously there was, Stalinism and communism and all of that in the Soviet Union. It's very bad in many, many ways. But I think the one thing that stuck with me was when they went to evacuate these towns, and yes, they didn't evacuate them, maybe as fast as they should have. But when they did go to evacuate these towns, everybody left in like the rate at which they evacuated people was incredible. And I just think of, here in the U.S. when we have hurricanes and stuff and we're trying to tell people to evacuate, and, like, half the people stay behind and they don't listen. And, so it struck me that, you had a population that was so used to just doing whatever their government said that when the government did tell them to evacuate, they got on the buses and, I don't think any of them appreciated that they would never return. They took kind of bare minimum stuff with them. But then they also talked about the efforts that the first responders went to. And they sacrificed their lives, not having any idea what they were exposing themselves to, the radiation, the danger. So many of them, died in the days and weeks and months afterwards, but also how much they were in a race against time to prevent any further explosions. And there was at one point in the video that they showed us where, they made the point, and again, I don't know how much this is an exaggeration or not, but making the point that, if they had not taken certain steps and there had been a second explosion, that second explosion basically could have wiped out all of Europe.
Yeah, that was the big concern that I recall is that
just, and I wasn't old enough at the time to really appreciate, any of that was going on. But to just be there and hear about that, just gives you chills.
Yeah, the sacrifices that people made to save essentially Western Europe, because if I recall right, the wind patterns would just take all of that plume of very deadly radiation just west and wipe out, big swaths of Western Europe. That's why I was really interested in what it was like and to see the reactors still there and just the abandoned buildings. There was a point in your book you were in Minsk, and you had been traveling, I think, in some parts of Europe there, Warsaw, in Poland and so forth, and you came back and you wrote that you were heartbroken by what you had seen. What did you mean by that?
So, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but in Belarus, in particular? Well, so I made a detour to Warsaw, where, I had a chance there to visit, trying to think of the Warsaw Rising Museum, and visit another former prison, and do some walking tours, to just learn about the history of Warsaw and what they went through, during, the 1930s, 1940s. And it really struck me that, again, even though I majored in Russian and East European studies, I took classes on Soviet politics, all of these things, I didn't feel like anything that I learned in school really taught me about the impact on the people, and some of it may just be that, reading it in a book, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, and you don't really get a feel for it. But being, in Warsaw and, just being able to picture, seeing exhibits of what the city looked like then, and then seeing how it's been reconstructed, and, listening to firsthand counts. I'm blanking on the name of the prison that I visited, but there was actually a surviving prisoner there that was telling his story. And to hear and see all of that, it just impacts you in a way that's hard to describe, because I feel like, particularly for us here in the U.S., like, we just have, with the exception of, 9/11, it's like we just haven't experienced anything like that. And it just, I don't know, it was just so heartbreaking. And then I get to Belarus and visited a site there that I went to with a couple Belarusians that I had met, and they had never been to the site before. It was a memorial site from World War II, which they tend to call the Great Patriotic War. And it was a memorial to a village that had been completely burned down, and the entire village had been killed. But then, as part of the memorial, there was like another part of the memorial that was dedicated to the 1 in 4 Belarusians that lost their lives. And you think about that, 25% of the population being killed in just a matter of a few years. And again, that was something like I knew nothing about. And I think, most people here know nothing about that. And it just, it breaks your heart to think about just how humans can be to each other, and you just wonder, it's like, why? What is this all for? That people, that there's so much violence and so much bad that happens there, and then you turn around and you go somewhere else and people are welcoming you with open arms as a stranger. And, it's sort of like, it reminds you that most of the world is really, really good, but there's so much value, though, I think, in learning about, they say if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. And, and I think it's true. And so I feel like I'm very fortunate that I had the opportunity to go over there and to experience and see some of the things that I did to learn about it. And, that was part of why I wanted to write the book, was, to help shed a light on some of these things for people, who may never have a chance to travel to some of these places, but also to maybe pique their interest in going to some of these places and seeing some of this firsthand.
It's interesting you say that, because I had a lot of the same experience and feelings when I was in Cambodia just a few months ago. And the Cambodian people are great people. I love that country. They're friendly. Food's really good. But then, you have that history of the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. And when I went to visit those and document that, it really, it calls into question. You wonder, how could people do this to each other? And what's, I think, a little frustrating for me, and probably for you in writing the book too, is when you want to come back and tell people about that, to remind them that you have to be on guard so that these things don't happen again. And the only way you can be on guard is know, one, acknowledge it happened and it can happen. Mm-hmm. The Germans before the rise of Nazism were a very liberal, democratic republic, modern. No one would have thought this could happen and come from them. The Cambodians before the Khmer Rouge, the people are so friendly and giving, but there's this part that's inside that could happen. So you have to remind people to be wary, be cautious, always be alert, so that it doesn't happen again.
And I think it's tough because, Yeah, and I heard this all the time on my trip. People would ask me, "Oh, how's your trip? How's your trip going?" And everyone wants to hear how amazing it is. Nobody wants to hear, "Oh, I visited this, former prison, yesterday. I visited this World War II memorial site." People, that's not what people want to hear about when they want to hear about your travels. And so, it's difficult to to keep bringing those things up, but I think it's really important.
Well, as a traveler too, because that gives you depth. Going to all the high points and sightseeing, yeah, that's pretty cool. Get some pictures. It's interesting, but you also to know about the whole breadth of the experience of the culture, from good to bad and everywhere in between. It gives you much better, I think, understanding, and then probably understanding of how common we all are. Because we're all dealing with the same thing.
Yeah.
Let me switch gears on you, get a little bit lighter subject going. For the different cultures that you went through, what is the one or two aspects of a culture that you came in contact with that you thought was so different from yours?
Great question. I mean, I've talked about it before, but I think it really is true. I think the hospitality and openness, I think here in the U.S., we've just become, I think, especially, in recent years, we've come to be so closed off and so suspicious of what is different that it's hard to imagine me, traveling around the U.S. and having people just welcome me into their homes and giving me meals and, insisting that I sit down with them. And that just happened everywhere that I went. People not even batting an eye, and being so curious about me and wanting to, learn about where I was from and share their stories with me. And I feel like that's something, that we just don't see here, anymore. I don't know if in years gone by, maybe there was more of that a long time ago. But I feel like we've become just so suspicious of what's different and so isolated here in the U.S. that, I think that was the one cultural thing that really stuck with me. I mean, obviously there were some other things, I spent some time, when I was traveling through Turkey, I spent one night in a very, very conservative Muslim city. And that was one of the moments when I really kind of felt the fact that I was a woman traveler by myself. And I felt like people were really kind of looking at me like, why is she by herself? And, most women, had a hijab on and, or were even full robes. Yeah. Yeah. And so there, that really, I was sort of like, that was one of the first times when I was like, oh, wow, I really stand out here as being different. One of the nice things traveling through Russia as a blonde, I blended in a lot. So I didn't stand out too much most of the time I was traveling through Russia and Eastern Europe because I was able to blend in pretty well. But yeah, I mean, other, sort of interesting cultural quirks here and there, food wise and things. But I think the hospitality was one that just, stood out to me everywhere I went.
Nice. I got to pause 1 minute because I have a cat that's meowing. I got to let him out.
I can hear that.
So for folks who heard the meowing in the background, that was my cat Loomis. And if you ever saw him, this cat has the craziest eyes you've ever seen. He's a snowshoe and a beautiful cat. Quirky personality, but he's got these crazy eyes. So I just had to let him out. He didn't want to be part of the podcast anymore. Also, at the time you were preparing, you were reading journals and diaries from, was it a grandmother who passed away? She was, or great aunt?
Yeah, grandmother.
Grandmother.
Yeah.
And those struck you in that she was sort of an adventurer, traveler herself.
Yeah.
So how did you think that influenced you to sitting in cold Chicago saying, I'm going to pull up stakes and let's go see the world. How do you think that played?
It's fascinating. So I have no memories of my grandmother. I was only 7 or 8 when she passed away. And it wasn't until years later that one of my aunts came across all of these boxes of belongings of hers. And I've gotten really into genealogy as a hobby. And so I've traced all my family history and whatnot. And so when my aunt found all of these things of my grandmother's, she was like, Katie, do you want to take a look through these? And it just struck me. It was one piece in particular. It was an essay that she wrote in college where she wrote about, how, and now it's kind of a non-PC term, but she wrote about how she felt like a gypsy and, she had this wanderlust and, wanted to see the world. And she, read, so much in books about all these places. And, it was just fascinating. Like she named Moscow as one of the places she dreamed of seeing someday. And I, was actually able to go there. But she did things when she was a young woman in her late teens, early 20s. She was living in Des Moines, Iowa, and it was the 1930s or so. She was traveling by herself by train around the country, which, I just have to think of like, wow, that was not done back then. And so, to know, that my grandmother was doing those type of things and having these types of adventures, it's like when I started reading all of that, I was just like, oh, this is where I get it from. Like, finally, I know where this wanderlust comes from. It's from her. Last quick story. I was going from Turkey back into Georgia and ended up in a car with a Turkish gentleman because the bus that I was supposed to take, it turned out wasn't running that day. And this Turkish gentleman offered for me and another gentleman to, share a taxi with him to the border. And then in the border town, he arranged for us to get a minibus that was supposed to take us all the way to Tbilisi. And I gave him a certain amount of money and I was sort of like, the whole way, there was a voice in the back of my head that was sort of like, I don't know if this is completely legitimate. I may be getting scammed here. But there were also signs that there was this older gentleman, probably in his 70s, who was also probably getting scammed if I was getting scammed. and his presence, made me feel a little bit more at ease. But then as soon as we got across the Turkish border into Georgia, we got into a car with a Georgian driver who I could speak Russian to. And the Turkish guy, who I thought might have been trying to scam me, didn't speak Russian at all. And so as soon as I started talking to the taxi driver in Russian, the look on the Turkish guy's face was sort of like, oh, wow. And I told the taxi driver, I explained to him, I was like, I've already given this guy this much money. He told me that this would take me all the way to Tbilisi. I'm not giving him any more money. And the guy turned around and basically was like, you're like my sister. I'm going to take care of you. Don't worry. And I knew, and again, Georgian hospitality, taking care of everyone. Then, I immediately felt at ease and I was like, okay, this is under control. But you just sort of have to trust your intuition, which I think you develop, over time as a traveler and just being in different situations. But yeah, you have to open yourself up or you just don't have the experience.
Well, I think in addition, at least me observing what you just said and talking to other explorers, all that experience gave you people skills, picking up on the cues, but also you had a confidence. You knew what you could do and handle yourself, and you kept expanding that confidence layer, that confidence area as you gain more and more experience. And so things that look crazy to other people, you are now going, no, I've been doing things like that. I know what to expect. I know what to look for. So it may be crazy for you, but with my experience, it's like a mountain climber. They're not going to climb Everest on the first day, but if they spent 20 years climbing mountains, Everest isn't as daunting as it might have been. Yeah. What's next for Katie as far as adventure and travel?
Oh, so I have 2 trips coming up this summer, which are decidedly not adventurous, but should be very fun. I am taking my 15-year-old niece to see Taylor Swift in Dublin, which will be its own kind of adventure. She has never left the country before, so this this is something, I think an opportunity for her to get a taste of travel and hopefully start falling in love with travel.
And carrying on the family tradition.
Exactly. And then I'm going to the Olympics in Paris in August.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, very excited for that. And then next winter over New Year's, I'll be going back to Tanzania. Since my book, I've become, in the last few years, very hooked on Africa as a continent, and going on safaris, and become very passionate about wildlife and wildlife conservation. So that's kind of my next chapter now that I'm focused on in my travels.
So for folks who want to follow you, how would they do that?
Yeah, so I'm very consistent and make it very easy. I'm basically just my name on social media everywhere. So it's Katie Aune, Katieaune. That's me on Twitter, on Instagram, on Threads, on Facebook. That's also my website, katieaune.com. So yeah, I keep it pretty simple.
And your book, the title is?
So the title of my book is Finding Katya, How I Quit Everything to Backpack the Former Soviet States. You can find it on Amazon, paperback or Kindle version. Also links to any place you like to buy books. If you go to bookshop.org, if you like to support independent bookstores, you can find your favorite independent bookstore and order it through bookshop.org to support independent bookstores, because I know a lot of people don't like to throw their money at Amazon as much.
Well, Katie,
I like to support the independent bookstores.
Good. Katie, it has been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for joining us. They've been great stories. And once you do that trip around Africa and you write that book, please come on back and tell us about it.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
It has been a pleasure. So we'll see you down the road.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhardt.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.